remember them all. The Countess fought, Mary Devereux fought, Nellie Gifford fought, Lily Kempson fought, Julia Brennan fought, Maud O'Reilly fought, Winnie Carney fought, and Bridget Goff. The women and girls of common among stood beside the Fenian men. This is the Fenian women's blues. Let's remember them. It was little known what the record showed of their participation. An integral part right from the start against the occupation. But they were demonized and ostracized by a patriarchal system, airbrushed out without a doubt from historical narration. For their contribution to the liberation of our state. This is the Fenian women's blues. Let's remember their names. Jenny Shanahan fought, Miss Connolly fought, Liz O'Farrell fought, and Madeline fought. The Norgroves fought, Helena fought, Rosie Hackett fought, and Martha Walsh, Miss Skinnider, Margaret Keogh, Dr Kathleen Lynn. There were many more. This is their song. Let's salute to them.
It wasn't until the 1980s or early 90s that the role of women in the Rising received the attention it deserved. Up until then, their role was ignored or minimised. This is no surprise, given the attitudes to women across the generations in Ireland, which were certainly not based on the values of equality or social justice, values that motivated the participants in the Rising. Nowadays, there are many wonderful books about telling the stories of the involvement of women in the Rising, before and after. They include stories about our own relatives, of which we are so proud. But what they all had in common was a belief that change was needed in Ireland. Women would play an equal role in the building of a new Ireland, enjoying equal status with men. The words of the proclamation clearly reflect this aspiration. Who were the women involved in the Rising? They were shop assistants, dressmakers, nurses, teachers, clerks, artists, actresses, and one doctor.
It's a great honour to have the privilege of unveiling this headstone in Dean's Grange to commemorate Kathleen Lynn on the anniversary of her death and the centenary of the founding of the St. Ultan's Hospital for Infants. She met other great women of her time, and meeting Countess Markievicz and Helena Maloney, that led her to Liberty Hall, where she served the soup kitchens in 1913. And that, of course, in its turn, led her to Jim Larkin and James Connolly, and the trade union movement and the Irish Citizen Army.
Kathleen Lynn saw Ireland not as a colony but as a nation, and joined the Irish Citizens Army of James Connolly, in which she was appointed its medical officer.
So today we gather to remember and honour Dr Kathleen Lynn, revolutionary, socialist, suffragist, feminist, trade unionist and pioneering doctor. A remarkable woman who devoted her life to the cause of Irish freedom and social justice for all.
And she was one of the greatest women in history, I think, Kathleen Lynn, because she straddled all of the major progressive movements from the end of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th. And it was a life shared with many brave and visionary women who not only dreamt of the best for Ireland, but pursued that dream with courage and imagination, making many personal sacrifices in order to play their part in crafting a fairer and more just world.
In discussing her role in later life, she said about herself that she was quite sympathetic to the militant side of things.
So in preparation for the Easter Rising, as Chief Medical Officer, she trained the members of the Irish Citizen Army and the volunteers in first aid. And in the Rising herself, she transported armaments in her car, and she brought the medical supplies for setting up first aid stations to all of the different rising points. And then she was second in command to Sean Connolly.
The gate of the City Hall was locked and I had to climb over it, though I don't know how I did it. It was a beautiful day. The sun was hot and we were not long there when we noticed Sean Connolly coming towards us, walking upright, although we had been advised to crouch and take cover as much as possible.
Margaret Davis, she was actually up on the roof of City Hall. He's hoisting the flag, and a British sniper basically shot him in the head, and he died pretty much in minutes. But you had Margaret Davis beside him, Helena Maloney was there, his sister was there, and Kathleen Lynn was downstairs. And again, from the accounts, you got this sense of helplessness because there was nothing they could do to save him. Bridget Davis, our nurse's apron that she was wearing, she kept that for the rest of her life, never washed it. His bloodstains are still on that. It's actually in Claidheamh jail at the moment.
We suddenly saw him fall, mortally wounded by a sniper's bullet from the castle. First aid was useless. He died almost immediately.
The fighting at Easter week saw her in the City Hall, and when her commanding officer was killed, Kathleen took command of the garrison.
And they held the City Hall until they were forced, because of grenades and bayonet point, to surrender.
A regiment of British soldiers arrived at the castle, I think in the late afternoon. I often thought afterwards that it was surprising that those soldiers were allowed to enter the castle yard unmolested by our men. I think that Sean Connolly's death had a demoralising effect on the City Hall men. It was a pity some attack was not made on them, because immediately after their arrival the fusillade started. The bullets fell like rain.
But City Hall could have fallen a lot sooner. It actually could have been taken on one day, but due to the quick thinking of the women, that didn't happen. Because when the military were trying to get in, climbing through the windows and so on, the women who were on the upper floors, they started shouting across to each other. So making it look like there was 200 or 300 people in the building when you've got less than 30. But the military pulled back. And then it's not until Tuesday that garrison actually did surrender. And what that shows is the quick thinking, how the women could actually think on their feet. And again, it's like the women are training for what is to come.
We had come down from the roof and were collected in the hall. The firing came from all sides and continued till after darkness fell. There was no way of escape, although we discussed all possibilities. When I told him I was a doctor, he thought I had just come in to attend to the wounded. I informed him that I belonged to the Citizen Army, which surprised him very much. We were marched through the castle yard to Ship Street Barracks and put into a large room which seemed to be underground.
There were about 300 women directly involved in the Rising, members of the Irish Citizen Army and Cumann na mBan.
She was handed the flag in Beresford Place from James Connolly, and then she was escorted to the roof of Liberty Hall, where the flag was hoisted.
Palm Sunday, she hoisted the flag, and she was so small they had to put her on a chair to hoist it up. But she was supported by 3 train bearers, and one of them was Sean Connolly's daughter, Monica.
When the Citizen Army was in formation outside of Liberty Hall, she was in the ranks. And someone told her mother, they lived at the end of Gardner Street, and the mother ran across and tried to pull her out. But she told her mother to go home and mind the babies, that she was going with Mr. Connolly. She was bringing communiques back and forward between City Hall and the GPO.
And one of her last dispatches back to James Connolly was that Sean Connolly, the Abbey actor, had been killed.
And she was there until the end of the rising.
I think maybe the women were ahead of their time, and certainly getting women written into the proclamation, and the fact that I know in the Irish Citizen Army they definitely were treated as equal, because James Connolly was very progressive in that way. And
when we actually come to 1916, just in the lead up to it, you have the Hope gun running, where guns are brought from Germany by Erskine Childers and his wife, Molly, and also Mary Spring Rice. That actual idea was planted by Mary Spring Rice. But Mary Spring Rice, not only did she suggest that they should bring in the arms, she gave £2,000 of her own money. She was a member of the Limerick Cumnaman, and she actually went on the expedition herself. Other women do make their ways to GPO later on, Min Ryan and so on, because these women, they've been sent down to the country with the countermanding order that is published in the newspapers. You've got women being sent all over the country, down to Wexford, down to Cork, Galway and so on, with word that the rising is going to happen. So as they come back, when they come back, the GPO has been taken over, but they do eventually make their way in and are there for the week. Now you find that the women are deliberately told not to be in uniform, and the reason for that was because of the type of work that they had to do. If they were in uniform, they'd be easy targets for the military. So the type of work they'd be doing would be dispatch carrying, bringing weapons and ammunition supplies to all the different outposts, so they could easily go through if they're not in uniform, and that's why you only have the likes of Countess Markievicz and Kathleen Lynn actually in uniform in 1916.
You made some surprising discoveries concerning women who were in the GPO. Could you elaborate on this?
Sure. I think in many previous books from years ago, it was said there were 34 women in the GPO. And I really found there were far, far more women in the GPO than that. Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, for example, is listed in the book. Now, most people would say that she was a pacifist, and she was. But she might have been one of the most unpacifistic pacifists I know. In the early 1900s, she was thrown in jail several times when she was demonstrating for women's suffrage. One of those times she was thrown in jail because the demonstration included breaking all the windows in Ship Street Barracks. So she was much more of an aggressive person than was her husband Francis. But she came to the GPO on Monday with food, stayed there and cooked for the rebels. Then on Tuesday she did the same thing to the rebels in St. Stephen's Green when they went to the College of Surgeons. And then of course on Wednesday her husband Francis was so tragically killed. I think if you take a look at the women and how they were used in the various garrisons, you can see some sexism involved in there. And of course we have the situation with De Valera where he didn't have any women in his garrison. But if you take a look actually at De Valera, I think that's a starting point. And he not only didn't have any women there, but he said that one of the reasons was he thought that they would not be useful in a garrison in which the people were going to be moving around a great deal. If you take a look at his garrison, his was one of the garrisons that didn't move around very much. De Valera once said to her that he was actually very sorry he didn't have women in his garrison because it meant that some of his best men had to spend their time cooking.
So two women that we have here that refused to obey orders. You've got Leslie Price on the left and Eilish Noreen on the right. And they were two women that met at the Black Church and then made their way into the GPO. Now Leslie Price got into the GPO, Eilish Noreen was delayed, and by the time she got to the GPO, she was turned away. She was told that they had enough men or enough women in the GPO, so finding her place to go, and she went across the road to Rhea's Chambers. Now again, from the accounts of the women, Blimey O'Connor, when the girls knocked on the door to get into Rhea's, Blimey O'Connor, he was delighted to see them because he had eaten all his rations in the first few hours. And again, it's this whole thing of food. And she and her friends, I think it was Brie Dixon possibly, they were sent back over to the GPO to get food. But Desmond Fitzgerald, who was in charge of the kitchen in the GPO, he seemed to be very protective of the food, because he refused to give him any for the men. And she had to threaten to physically fight him to get the food. And then he agreed to give her they gave her some milk and a small portion of food. But when they got back, and they had to cross O'Connell Street under gunfire, they got back safely. And again, the men were just so thrilled because it was survival for them. They kept that garrison going. With Leslie Price, in the first couple of days, she's sent from outpost to outpost, from the GPO to the forecourt and back again. And if you look, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you've got more or less gunfire happening, there's gun battles, but the British can't get into the city centre because of all the other outposts that are stopping them from getting in. And on Thursday, the GPO was being shelled. The city is falling down around him, and James Connolly has been wounded severely. There's chaos in the GPO, volunteers are wounded left, right and centre. And Tom Clark, who's sort of taking command now, he basically decides that although he doesn't agree with it, maybe a priest should be on hand to assist, tend to the men if this is their last few hours. And he asked Leslie Price to go. Now, as she says, she was terrified. And there wasn't a fly out on O'Connell Street, according to her. And she's fighting back to tears because she cannot cry in front of Tom Clark. It is Tom Clark. And she agrees to go. Now, she describes her journey, goes through Moore Street, makes her way in Parnell Street, and she's waiting at the foot of the statue of Parnell, waiting for the bullets to stop so she can dart across into Sean McDermott Street, down to Marlborough Street, and she gets to the priest's house. And when the priest opens the door, he starts to give out to her, saying that she's in a revolution, that's fine, she shouldn't be doing that, she's a young girl. But what really annoys the priest is that who she is with are a bunch of Reds and a bunch of socialists. It's James Connolly and so on. It's not the volunteers he has a problem with, it's the volunteers, the citizen army. Now, she gives as good as she gets because she starts to berate him. And as she says, no, she had confession, she was at peace with herself, but he was a priest, and it would do him good to do his job and tend to the men who might need solace. But she was going back one way or another, with or without him, she was going back. And he agrees to go back with her, and she gets him back safely. And as she says again, that she was just delighted to hand him over. As soon as she gets in, she just hands him over to whoever, and then she's done with him. But she was starving. And the thing is, in the officers' mess, you had to hold a rank to eat in the officers' mess in the GPO, and she's promoted in the field, so she could actually eat in the officers' mess.
Some of the women in their training were trained particularly in first aid. They were trained in supplementary or supportive activities for the men. They did have some rifle competitions, and some people did involve themselves in that, but that wasn't very common. One of the ones who was one of the best marks persons, if you will, was Winifred Carney up in Belfast. She was one of the best shots anywhere up there.
Only one woman marches off from Liberty Hall to take over the GPO with the headquarters staff, and it's this lady here, Winnie Carney, a member of the Belfast Coming On, but she was actually requested by James Connolly to come down to Dublin to be with him, and she's a secretary. She is his right-hand man in the GPO. And if you look, what they say is when she marched off, she was armed with a typewriter in one hand and a revolver in the other. And that typewriter, she worked that typewriter for the whole week. But when you look at 1916 as the rising goes on, and James Connolly is giving orders for men to go out to the different outposts and come back with dispatches and so on, he tells them that if they can't get to him, they have to report back to Winnie Carney. Now, obviously, the men are surprised at this. Sean Noonan was taken aback, and he questioned this, and Connolly's response was, treat her the way you treat me. So that's how highly he held these women. That's how high a regard he had for Winnie Carney.
If you take a look at another man in the Rising, Patrick Pearse, and you ask what was his attitude, it was very paradoxical. He said he did not want to think of women drilling and marching in the ordinary way as soldiers, but he didn't think there was anything wrong with teaching them how to shoot. One that is, of course, very famous for it was Margaret Skinnider, who was in St. Stephen's Green. And actually, she was leading a patrol down to the Russell Hotel at one time, where she was wounded 3 times. But when she wrote her book, Doing My Bit for Ireland, she didn't pull any punches, and she was on the rooftop there at the College of Surgeons. And what she said was, many times I saw the man I shot at fall.
Just to show one woman who actually did an awful lot more to make sandwiches. When they took over a university church, the military, there was a plan that the ICA would attack the Russell Hotel, which was on the corner of Harcourt Street. It's the big red brick building now right in the corner. The idea was attack that, spread a fire that would spread to the university church, smoke out the military, and they would then evacuate, so take out that position. And she's chosen to be a part of that group of men. She's with William Partridge and Fred Ryan. But what they didn't know is that in number 6 Harcourt Street, the military had actually set up a post, and it's overlooking the Russell Hotel. So when they get to their position, and they have to smash open the doors with the rifle butts, but one of the guns goes off, and the British soldiers see the spark, they open fire, and she was shot 3 times, once in the spine. Fred Ryan was killed, he was only 18, and they managed to get her back to the safety of the College of Surgeons, but they didn't know if she was going to survive because she was so severely wounded. She was delirious, and she recalls sort of having this out-of-body experience because they're all panicking around her, and she thinks this is it, this is the end. But she did survive, spent 7 weeks in hospital.
Josie O'Keefe was in the area of Smithfield in Jameson's distillery, and she sat in a window with Bobby Holland during the whole week. And they sat there with two rifles. He would shoot at the British out of the window, she would load the other rifle, and they would switch off. He simply could not have done that without her help, and she was in view of the British just as he was. She was in harm's way the whole time.
And ideally you'd have a volunteer in every window overlooking, but you haven't got enough. So what they do with the women are attached to a volunteer. So in the case of Josie O'Keefe, she's with Robert Holland, and she was his eyes, she was his ears, she was spotting for him, because he had quite a number of guns overlooking the position of the canal, but it would be this way and that way. So she's basically telling them where the soldiers are coming. And as he's firing his weapon, she's loading the guns for him. So again, this is more than making sandwiches. She's actually right there. She is his eyes and his ears.
Josie O'Keefe brought a Lee Enfield and a Mauser and a haversack full of ammunition. I would teach her to load them and leave them on the floor at my hand, as I might have to fire from either side of the building. She learnt very quickly. She remarked how heavy the Mauser or Huaithne rifle was. Each cartridge for it was 6 inches long and weighed 1/4 pound. It made a very large entrance and exit hole. Then Josie McGowan came along with another rifle. The 2 girls stayed with me until it was almost dark, and then brought me up a can of tea and some bread and a can of fresh water. I was completely blackened at the time from the powder of the Huaithne rifle. When the girls had gone, I took off my shirt and left it off and put back my coat and waistcoat.
So while many of the women did spend their time in the kitchens, did do cooking and that sort of thing, there were a great many others who were actually in the firing line and did so very, very courageously.
Lucy was a member of the medical nursing contingent, so though I do know she was delivering dispatches, and she was moving between the Hibernian Bank and the GPO, and she was out and about in the line of fire messaging. when Tom arrived in the GPO, she arrived with a basin of water and a pair of clean socks for him, and he thanked her kindly. So I thought that was a very lovely touch in amongst the fire and the munition factory, and the bravery and courage to see that act of concern and kindness.
But when we look at Friday, when the GPO was falling down around them, Pierce actually called all the women together and he thanked them for all their efforts, for all their help, but it was too dangerous, he had to leave. Now, you would think by saying that okay, they were free to go. No, the women had to actually bring the wounded from the GPO through a war zone up to Dairy Street Hospital, and any number of those women could have been killed.
Relative Elizabeth O'Farrell, better known as Nurse Elizabeth O'Farrell, made her way over here with a couple of women. They thought the whole thing had been called off, and they were out in the Southside branch based in where Cummin Nagelga is now, over in 6 Harcourt Street, and they had to make their way over here. So only a few women actually made their way from that branch for them, got into the GPO, and they started working in the GPO over the days. And it was on the 28th, Padraig Pearse asked Cummin all the other members of Cummin to leave. Winifred Carney insisted. They went up and they said they weren't going to leave. Winifred Carney wasn't going to leave Connolly. She was his private secretary. And Elizabeth O'Farrell said there's no way she was going to leave either. There was wounded to tend to, including Connolly himself, who was wounded. And Julia Grennan, who was her lifelong friend and companion, said she wasn't going to leave her friend either. So the 3 women stayed. We left in 3 sections. There was bullets hailing all over us. This is what Elizabeth says in her account. And she said Padraig Pearse, she was in the last section, as they left in 3 sections, and Padraig Pearse was the very last to leave the building, to evacuate the building. He went around to check there was nobody left behind and no wounded. So they crossed then in 3 sections. Elizabeth O'Farrell was in the last section, and they made their way then onto Henry Place, down Henry Place. Okay. And then across onto Moore Lane.
There must have been a lot of gunfire at the time, or?
There was bullets hailing over their head, and it was very, very dangerous. Well, you'll find that Moore Lane also comes in significance later on, as when she was walking out with the actual surrender letter, that she also mentions Moore Lane, and she mentions its significance to O'Reilly as well, and she had earlier on, she'd seen his hat, and I'd gone on the ground, and she had thought that he'd made his way safely into a house. And then when she came back then later on with the final surrender thing, the final surrender with Pearse, they saw his body. It was very dangerous as well, because there were again bullets raining over their heads. You look clearly, you'll actually see some of the buildings and some of the scars from the bullets are still there.
Okay, Donna, so do you want to say what happened here about the trip?
Yeah, well, Elizabeth O'Farrell tripped, they made their ways, you see, in quite a rush after they got through the barricade and made their way down, and she tripped here at the corner of Moore Lane and Moore Street, and Sean Gary came out and helped her up, and then she made her way into the house. And if he hadn't done that, I think that would have been the finish of her, So Elizabeth O'Farrell then made her way into the parlour of the house, and many of the provisional government were already in the house, and she went over to James Connolly. He was in a bad way at this stage. and Elizabeth was asked would she carry the notice of surrender out to the British Army, and they decided first of all to put a white flag outside the building. So they hung a white flag outside here. It's actually outside this window. She actually stepped out at number 15 and they put a white flag outside the window first of all, and she herself had her white flag and a red cross, and she stepped out. There would have been a door and she would have stepped out here and she looked behind her, and we know it was number 15 because she knew herself that it was a very historic moment, because she looked behind her and she said number 15. And then she made her way down with the notice of surrender to the barricade, and spoke to a British Army, the British Army there, and they all he asked her was, "Oh, are there many women left?" And she said, "There's just 3 women." And he said, "Well, you'd want to get them out of there." And he was about to usher her back, put her back over the barricade, and then he realised that he should probably get this message to my superiors, which he did do. And she was brought then to speak to General Lowe, and he said he would only take an unconditional surrender, and that he would take it from Pearse himself. He said, "What is he? Can he walk? Does he need to be taken on a stretcher?" And she said, "No, Pearse isn't wounded." And he had got it wrong. It was Connell that was wounded. So she was also asked about Countess Markievicz, how is she holding up there, and she said she's not there at all. So they had their information wrong. So she went back with a note from General Lowe to Padraig Pearse. They had another meeting, and a surrender letter was taken. This was about 2:30.
Anna, do you want to say now what happened at this point?
Well, this is the location where the actual surrender took place. It may have started the surrender on the other side of the road, but over here is where the actual photograph was taken, the iconic photograph where Pearse, Elizabeth O'Farrell, General Lowe and his son John Lowe, and Pearse handed over his sword, which was a ceremonial method of surrender. This is where the iconic photograph was taken, where people say that Elizabeth O'Farrell was airbrushed out of the photograph. Well, there was a bit of touching up on the photograph, which would have been a technique at the time, but the fact that she wasn't seen in the photograph is because she stepped back herself. What was removed was maybe the ends of her skirt and her shoes later on in the publication. But if you see, the actual original photograph is now in the ownership, and it's in the National Museum. And with the Browning sepia photograph, you can very clearly see her skirt now and her shoes, and very clearly identifying that she's there. She stepped out of it. She said that it was because she didn't want her photograph taken. She didn't want to be identified in the surrender photograph. She didn't want to give them the satisfaction. But I think there were maybe many reasons. She was maybe conscious of her security, of her family's security, of her sister, as well being afterwards. So I think she was thinking of people and thinking that she didn't necessarily want her face identified. Later on she regretted it, because Cumann na Món were not the handmaidens. They were active. Some of them fought, some of them nursed. They took various roles, but all of them significant roles. After that, type letters were given, and General Lowe asked would Elizabeth O'Farrell be willing to bring the surrender letter to all the various garrisons, and she agreed to that. So after that, Pearse was led off, and she was taken then down Parnell Street, and to make her way then down Capel Street, and to go off then to the Four Courts. So that was the start of her journey with the surrender letter.
She said, and I think it's so true today, the greatest gifts that the young women of Ireland can bring into public life with them are ideals and principles.
We stand among the dead generations from which we receive our nationhood. We stand on ground which many of our own ancestors stood upon as they gathered in solidarity at funerals such as O'Donovan Ross's. We stand on ground which Margaret herself stood upon as she paid her respects to her brave comrades. We stand on ground where 300,000 Irish people gathered some 90 years ago on this day, July the 15th, 1927, to pay respects to this noble-hearted, heroic Irish woman. Let us remind ourselves of this woman. Let us pay our respects to this Ban Uasal, Ban Eirnach, Ban Leach, Ban Le Mishnach, Ban Le Fis, Ban Le Fish, Ban Le Fé Le Flahulacht. Let us remember this heroic woman who broke the mould, paving the way for greater freedoms for Irish women and men. Freedoms and liberties which are expressed so well in our proclamation and which we are still struggling to bring about in our time. Born in 1868 post-famine Ireland to a wealthy Church of Ireland ascendancy landowning family, the Gorboots of Sligo, we remember the woman who opened her heart and mind and wealth, generously embracing the dispossessed of our home county Sligo and later the poor and impoverished of Dublin. The 300,000 people who gathered here mourning her passing 90 years ago were described then as the ordinary working people of Ireland. Among them my own grandfather, Tio Shocknessy, and James's Walk the Liberties. We remember the woman who herself experienced marginality, imprisonment, deprivation and finally poverty because of her own brave choices in the pursuit of social justice. We remember the woman who first joined Inní na hÉireann and later, inspired by James Connolly, the Irish Citizen Army, and who bravely fought with the women of Cumann asserting their right to take up arms alongside men in the cause of Irish freedom. We remember the woman who challenged the existing political structures and who broke the mould in being the first elected female MP to Westminster and subsequently the first female TD to the Dáil Éireann, becoming Minister for Labour. We remember the woman who had the vision and wisdom to know that the youth of Ireland must be at the heart of the new republic, founding Fianna Éireann along with Bulmer Hobson and growing it with Con Colbert, thereby promoting a healthy patriotism and a pride in the Gaelic culture and language which in the 18th and 19th centuries had been decimated. As Pearse famously said, if Na Fianna had not been founded in 1909, there would have been no volunteers in 1913. De Markievicz work lay at the heart of the rising and movement for Irish independence. Many of us here have relatives who were in Fianna Éireann and went on to be volunteers.
It's remarkable that somehow she has been hidden from Irish history. And we have to ask ourselves, what was that about? Was it because, in a kind of inverted snobbery, we felt that she was one of the landed classes, and therefore there was something alien about her? Was it because she was an extremely good markswoman? She was a woman of the ascendancy. She rode a horse, she hunted, and she had that extremely good marksmanship, which was unfairly described, when she was second in command to Michael Mallon in Stephen's Green as, a woman who loved to shoot. That was so unfair. She actually should be an icon of the Irish Army. And secondly, we have to remember that she was second in command in 1916, and she was sentenced to death. And again, there were catty remarks, unfair remarks, not just by women, they were actually by men at her trial, that she wept and that she begged not to be shot. That's nonsense. She wasn't that kind of a woman at all. And there's no evidence that kind of gossip went, just pure and quiet gossip. And I think too, we should stay, because I noticed it last year, she should be claimed by us all as one of the most prominent military leaders in 1916 rebellion. Yes, she was second in command to Michael Mallon in Stephen's Green, but it was much more than that. She was one of the leaders of 1916. She could have been shot, but the British knew there would be an outcry if a woman was executed for a political event such as the rebellion of 1916.
Eva Gorbooth, Constance's sister's words, her poignant words for her beloved sister.
And my own sister, through wild hours of pain, whilst murderous bombs were blotting out the stars. Little I thought to see you smile again, as I did yesterday, through prison bars. Dreamers turn fighters, but to find a grave. Too great for victory, too brave for war. Would you have dreamed the gentler dream of Maeve? Peace be with you, and love forevermore.
She was the vice OC, but in 1916 she's actually the commanding officer where these women fight, which is Marylebone Distillery. With Rose McNamara, again, leaves great accounts, because when the surrender does come, the men tell the women to leave, and the women refuse, because as they see it, they're comrades, they're equals, and what happens to the men will happen to the women as well. So they all march off together, march down to the Ross Road, which was their surrender point. But as they're going down the streets of Liberties, the women are singing to the men, God save Ireland. And again, it's not letting the military know that they are defeated. And John McBride is roaring back to the women saying, keep it up, keep it up. And again, it's such a vital support, the morale that they're keeping up of these men.
High upon the gallows tree swung the noble-hearted three, by the vengeful tyrant stricken in their bloom. But they met him face to face with the courage of their race, and they went with souls undaunted to their doom. God save Ireland, said the heroes. God save Ireland, said they all. Whether on the scaffold high or the battlefield we die, oh, what matter when for Erin dear we fall.
Women played a vital and substantial role in the Rising, and as we know, at the end 77 of them were arrested and brought to Richmond Barracks, after which some of them were imprisoned in Kilmainham jail and others in prisons in England. After the Rising, they continued their activism.
They start to reorganise, and you find that the women are the link between what did happen and what was to come. But these women are literally the beginning of what was to come. And when you look at what happens within a couple of months, you've got scenes like this, because we do know the stories of when the volunteers are being marched down to the docks to be shipped out to Stafford and all the internment camps and so on, that the people are throwing things at them and jeering at them, but then within 6 months, 12 months, you have scenes like this, and there's not an angry face amongst that crowd. The people are there to welcome home these men and women. They're coming back as heroes, and who did that were the women who fought in 16 and who became involved in the aftermath. And where you have the official version coming from the British government, there is another version coming from the Republican movement. And the British government made massive mistakes after 1916. One obviously was the executions of the leaders, but the other one was they underestimated the women, because when they were arrested, then before they were released, they're told to go home, do what women do, don't become involved in this. The women say yes, they mean a completely different thing, because as soon as they were released, they hit the ground running, and they started to show the Irish people that these men, it wasn't a name. That was a husband, that was a son, that was a father, that was a person, it was an honourable person. They had ideals, they loved their country.